being agile, being resilient. They've all been terms we've heard thrown around the supply chain for over a year. But what do we learn? What are the best practices? We're about to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Connections 2021.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria Kickham, and I am a senior editor at DC Velocity magazine. I'm here to moderate our final education session of the day, which is a panel discussion on supply chain resilience. This topic has been crucial during the past year as companies have faced unprecedented challenges stemming from the pandemic, along with global economic uncertainty. SMC3 has put together a panel of experts to discuss integrating supply chain resilience into your risk management strategy. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes. I'll start by introducing our panel, and then we'll jump right into a host of questions that I've put together. All of you in the audience are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A tab on your screen as well, and we will get to as many of those as possible. On our panel, we have Dave Malenfant, Director of Outreach and Partnerships for Texas Christian University's Center for Supply Chain Innovation. Donna Kintop, Senior Vice President of Client Experience at DDC FPO, a strategic business process outsourcing partner for the transportation and logistics industries. Chip White, the Schneider National Chair of Transportation and Logistics at the H. Milton Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And last but not least, Bindia Vakil, CEO at Resolink, a leading cloud provider of supply chain resilience and risk management, intelligence, and analytics. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
I'm going to start just by asking you about, just sort of opening it up to a general question. The pandemic highlighted the need for a greater focus on supply chain resilience and risk management. I wanted to ask, what are some of the lessons this past year has taught us, and what key areas should companies focus on moving forward? I'll start with you, Dave, since you're right at the front of my screen.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think what COVID taught us is that we weren't resilient. In fact, that survey was done and showing that maybe just a little over 20% of companies felt that they were resilient, which means that they were able to change sources, distribution, and visibility very, very quickly. I think what it also has taught us is that the idea of single sourcing that's been around for a long time did not bode well, and that we've now got to start thinking about how do we dual source. We found out that being able to move our product quickly was not there. But most importantly, I believe now that, especially in the transportation and logistics area, that enabling technology in order for us to become more agile is so important. And I'll close and let others comment on it by saying that now everyone can spell supply chain, because the disruptions that we encountered from COVID-19, which we call the bullwhip effect, and we've been very good at being able to predict bullwhip effect, but COVID-19 is something we've never seen before. So hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned technology. We're going to get into that in a minute. Donna, I'll go to you next. Just some general lessons learned and opening thoughts.
Sure. I think to help build resiliency going forward, we have taken a very proactive approach. I think it's important that people evaluated some of the difficulties they've had over the last year, and certainly be active in establishing more diversity in their geographic locations and expanding their footprint there, and making sure that their infrastructures have redundancy and have all of the structure in place so that movement can be quick and processes and people moved in a very agile way. I think it's important that you have business continuity plans that are solid, they're comprehensive, and they've been tested so that as we go forward, regardless of what's put on our plate, we're able to adapt to all of the changes.
Thank you. Great. I'll move on to you, Chip.
Okay, I think we learned several things. One thing, we had an over-reliance on foreign sourcing. And our supply chains are long. We've really tried to make them as lean as possible so that they are as inexpensive as possible, so we save as much cost as we can. But we've also neglected our domestic manufacturing ecosystem to the point where it's insufficient that if we lose our foreign sourcing, we don't have enough capacity stateside or with trusted, secure allies that it's able to compensate. The supply chains are able to compensate, or the ecosystem is. This, to some extent, been amplified by, I think, insufficient planning on the part at the national level also. One of the things that we've seen over the years is that the private sector has, and arguably so, I'd argue they've done the right thing by approaching domestic production to prioritize efficiency and low cost over some of the other characteristics like resilience. But our public policy also has approached domestic production with the same kind of criteria, and I think we've learned that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, that we need to be concerned about the resiliency of the ecosystem as well as the resiliency of any supply chain that is product specific or firm specific. So back to you, Victoria.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. No, those are excellent points. Bindia, what are your sort of opening thoughts and about lessons learned and where we are?
I think the biggest thing to me, in addition to everything that we heard so far, is the lack of visibility. You know, I think the biggest issue in supply chain sourcing, procurement, and logistics is often we map or understand our direct suppliers who we buy from or who we transact with. And we know where parts come from at that first level of the shipment, but we don't know actually where factories are located, who runs these factories, who are the suppliers. And so that's why the supply chain has this incredible, opaqueness, if you will, where we don't know that half of our products are coming from certain countries in Asia, what parts are coming from which location, and who's involved in building, sourcing, and moving our products. So I think the foundational problem is this lack of visibility, because of which we are always chasing problems, always at the mercy of events and disruptions that happen in different parts of the world.
Yeah, if I can just add something, Victoria, for a second.
Absolutely.
To what Bindia and Donna have said, what we found is that we weren't looking at the integrated supply chain from the supplier to the customer. We did a good job of looking at pieces of it, but when you hear what we all had to say, we all took a piece of that supply chain, when really, in order for us to get true resiliency and agility, that we've got to look at it as an integrated supply chain end to end. And that's something we weren't doing, but boy, are we doing it now. I think there's a lot of activity for us to start looking at it as an integrated supply chain.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. So I'm going to just dive right into this issue of technology and visibility. I'll start by using the term, we hear a lot about digital transformation of the supply chain. Can you each talk about sort of what role that plays in creating a more resilient supply chain, sort of building on what you've already sort of opened up here? And I'll start with, I guess I'll start with you, Bindia.
Yeah, I think, it all starts with data, right? I mean, the risk problem's really a data problem. That's how we look at the world. If you know two things, where are my sites located, where do things come from, and what is going on in those local areas of the world, it's all information. And knowledge makes the difference between parts getting to the destination on time versus getting there 2 weeks late. And so the two things, again, that are the data issues that we need to solve for. And keep in mind, this is data that does not really exist in any of our ERP or PLM or our transportation management systems. It's, again, supplier site locations where they actually manufacture, not their corporate office location, not their ship from location, but the actual factories, warehouses, DCs that make, store, or distribute parts, and who the supplier buys from and where are they located. So at least that two-tier visibility into the supply chain. And then the second is a continuous 24/7 monitoring of those locations for all the things that could bring down a supply chain. And that could be anything from a factory fire to an earthquake, hurricane, or weather event. It could be a labor strike, transportation issue. It could be some lawsuits or regulatory changes. You know, all of these things, if we have information, that information in the hands of the right people in the company can mean the difference between a, you know, lost a shipment to a, we're on top of this and we have a plan in place ahead of a disruption actually hitting us.
Thank you. Chip, can you elaborate on that as well, sort of the whole digital transformation and data, importance of that and in building resilience?
Right. Data, as mentioned by a couple of the panelists, is very important. Visibility and real-time data for real-time control of supply chains is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And I think the last panelist mentioned if it's in the right hands and action is taken on the basis of the information, then you can really monetize data in that case. And you can monetize it in a variety of different ways. You can minimize costs, but it also increases stability of the supply chain and also mitigates risk. So the value of data is certainly more than just minimizing cost or improving efficiency. It also mitigates risk.
Thank you. Thank you. Donna, do you want to weigh in on this as well from your perspective?
My pleasure. Yeah, from an operational partnership perspective, digital transformation to us means the faster we get clean, accurate data, the faster we can turn that around and help provide positive results for our partners. So, you know, we work consistently with all of our partners to see what can we do to automate, what can we do to help to make sure that that data comes across clean, comes across quickly, and that it provides some peace of mind and then lessens the burden on all of the manual labor that it takes to, you know, in the past generate that kind of data and deliver the kind of results that they need.
Thank you. Dave, anything else you'd want to weigh in on here?
And I'm going to take a slightly different angle. I think what digital there's absolutely no doubt that digital transformation has got to occur, that the logistics industry and a lot of industries have lagged. But what we've got to look at, what is it going to bring to us? We all know the data issues, but just imagine if we could start doing digital twinning, where we can really look at how our supply chain is really operating, doing the digital twin of that, so that we can do some predictive analytics of how to improve our supply chain and make better decisions based upon using that the digital information that we're receiving. And that's where we have to get to. Once we solve the data problem, which I think we will, and I think we're there, we're closer than we've ever been before. We're starting to implement artificial intelligence and machine learning throughout our supply chains. Now I'd like to see us go a step further and be more provocative and say we're going to use a digital transformation through the use of digital twinning to be able to do a much better job at doing risk analysis, predictive analytics, to maybe avoid a catastrophe like we've seen in the past.
Thank you. And actually, you were building on my next point, which is I wanted to sort of dig into that a little bit more. If we could talk a little bit about how achieving visibility, how once you do that, how do companies ensure that they're taking action on that data and the insights that those efforts produce, sort of building on what you were just talking about, Dave. And I'll throw that to Chip first if you want. So how do you actually you're gathering all this information. How do you make sure you're actually acting on it and in the right way?
Well, this is a decision-making issue. How do you take information and turn it into decisions? And there are a lot of tools that have been developed over the years. Operations research, has for many years knows a lot about inventory replenishment, capacity planning, some of the major issues that are associated with manufacturing as well as supply chains in terms of delivery and so forth. There's the Toyota production system, lean thinking ideas that are very helpful. In terms of building in resiliency, a couple of things I'd like to just mention there is we're talking about resilience. What does it mean? It means that the supply chain performs well in a crisis and recovers quickly after the crisis. But we really need to define those terms. The other thing is, what's a crisis? We've given a little bit of a list here. One of the things that we've mentioned pandemics, of course, and cyber attacks, extreme weather, great power conflict. But one thing we haven't mentioned is the one that's most perplexing, which is the unknown unknown. And how do you sort of plan and build an agile management structure around that so that you're able to respond to challenges? But one of the other things that's sort of been mentioned by one of the other panelists is, and I'll say it maybe more explicitly, that resilience is both definition dependent but also crisis dependent. For example, in terms of crisis, you might have for example, a durable goods manufacturer who has planned ahead, has 2 or 3 months worth of semiconductors in inventory, and can take the shock that the semiconductor industry has experienced pretty well. But at the same time, that same OEM might have only a single supplier with a single manufacturing facility making those P-valves that are necessary to make sure that the brakes in that durable goods, that vehicle that they're manufacturing works. So you can have resilience in some parts of your supply chain, and in other parts you may not have it.
Thank you.
Back to you, Victoria.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. Bindia, I'll go to you next. Can you build on what Chip was talking about, and also maybe weigh in on sort of the ability to act on all this information you're collecting to build resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a couple of really important points that Chip made. One was the fact that you're not uniformly resilient, and that is completely true, right? Because if you think about procurement experts or in supply chain in general, we have this idea that we're managing things based on what is the most expensive. So procurement, you'll always hear them say, we're managing the 20% of suppliers that are 80% of spend, which is good for cost savings as your goal, but it is really, really bad for risk management, because in order to ship a product, you need the little connector and the little semiconductor chip just as much as you need the giant chassis, right? So every single part that goes into a product is equally important if you want to drop a kit at the factory and ship that product out. And so when we talk about, we follow Toyota down the lean methodology and lean implementation journey. What we failed to notice was in parallel to a lean implementation, Toyota also had a very robust supply chain visibility and monitoring system. So there was a really interesting article in Bloomberg and Supply Chain Dive about how Toyota was not impacted by the semiconductor device shortage. And if you read that talked about the methodology where they took 1,500 components that are critical to impacting revenue, not spend, but revenue. And they managed those suppliers carefully. They map those components multiple tiers deep, and it's a beautiful case study in mapping, monitoring disruption, supplier collaboration, visibility, and risk management. And it allowed Toyota, and actually GM had the same thing, where they've had a pretty extensive mapping and monitoring capability in place since 2013. And both these companies have been operating with low to no impact due to this massive disruption, where other car companies have been impacted to the tune of 2.5 billion in pre-tax profit. So I think this is a huge opportunity for us to examine what makes companies get impacted and not get impacted, basically in an event that affected everyone, or should have affected everyone.
Thank you. Dave, I noticed you nodding and smiling at the beginning of Bindia's what she was saying. Do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I just want to share what, because it hit home what Bindia was saying, because I remember years ago when I was still in the industry, and one of our facilities actually had to shut down because of an item that was classified as a C item, annual spend of $75,000, but without that item, we couldn't make a product. So that being said, I want to now talk about how you take action on visibility. And I'd like to ask the audience, the way you measure your supply chain is through key performance indicators. But what do we measure? We measure descriptive KPIs. We measure what happened in the past, and so I ask a lot of transportation providers, when you go into your quarterly business reviews with the shippers, what are you looking at? Looking at what happened in the last quarter, or are we starting to look at predictive KPIs and prescriptive KPIs and look at what's going to happen in the next quarter, the next 6 months? That's how you get true visibility, is not only looking at the past, but really looking at what is going to happen in the future based upon what we have seen, and then being able to not only predict it, but how do we do prescriptive analytics? If there's a northeasterner coming, how do we reroute product, and how do we do that? And that's how we really take the information we've got and make it as resilient as possible by not only doing descriptive KPIs, but prescriptive and predictive KPIs.
Thank you. Donna, anything to add to that discussion, or anyone else? Start with you, and then anyone else who has more can certainly chime in.
Oh, certainly, Victoria. To add on Bindia's concept of uniform resiliency, if the goal is to have a lot of agility and be able to adapt and change on a dime, and be able to react quickly with all of the data and make the right decisions, very educated decisions, supply chain visibility across all partners is critical. From our perspective, the more visibility that we have to our partners' processes, data, and plans, the better we can help them achieve their goals. And so, it's visibility of data, it's visibility of process, it's visibility of plans that really help us be a better partner, across the industry. So, we look at it from a little bit different perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to take a minute just to remind the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A format, and we'll be happy to get to those as well. Just building on what you all were talking about, much of becoming more resilient involves improving communication with channel partners. I think that's wrapped up into this discussion, and I wanted you to weigh in on why that's so important, and maybe talk about what specific steps logistics companies can take to sort of improve communication with customers, suppliers, other channel partners. And I guess I'll start with you again, Chip. So
okay,
the communication piece. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just broaden it a little bit and
Sure.
talk about how you build in resilience. A lot of many techniques are related to just building in redundance, where you have additional inventory or additional capacity or storage capacity and so forth. But like you mentioned, communications or information has value. It also has cybersecurity risks, but it has value in terms of reducing cost and again the reducing risks, mitigating risks as well. One of the things that you need in order to trade or have your supplier, your enterprise, your total enterprise willing to share data is trust. And the value of trust is not insignificant. In going back to the Toyota production system and the role of partnerships that Toyota has with its first-tier suppliers is a remarkable study in how building long-term relationships really can help you not only perform better, but also when there is that P-valve fire in a supplier, first-tier supplier's facility, you have the entire community to help out, even though they're competitors the day before. They're cooperators and they're willing to collaborate. When there's a real threat to the institution of Toyota in that case. More accurate demand forecasts as certainly a way of being able to more accurately use predictive analytics. And there are a variety of different tools and techniques let's see, we have the AI techniques, OR statistics techniques. They're all very worth blending. But another way of increasing the value of information in a supply chain is to step back and not ask necessarily, can we buy additional data and mine the data for additional value, but also just think to ourselves, what if we redesigned our product and redesigned our supply chain so it's fundamentally more resilient, so we don't have quite as much of a need for high quality accuracy with our data. So there are at least some comments there, Victoria, related to your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Donna, do you want to weigh in on how communication helps build better resilience and from your perspective in the supply chain?
Sure. Absolutely. Communication is really just one of the foundational factors that are just critical to building a solid relationship. Prior to COVID, this industry was a no-norm industry. Post-COVID, it's a no-norm industry. And, we find that the partners that communicate with us on a very regular basis and provide very insightful information, the relationship deepens and we're able to provide a much more valuable solution to them. So, it may seem like common sense. It's important to communicate. It's important to have open communication. But when you implement it properly and it's sustainable and the quality of the information exchanged is really high, then it really does help, lead to success for both organizations or multiple organizations.
Thank you. Dave, how about you on this topic of communication?
Yeah, I agree with both what Chip and Don said. I'm a little bit concerned. I was talking to some shippers and some logistics providers last couple of weeks, and we're about to get into a real capacity constraint where logistics providers are not going to be able to deliver on a timely basis. So communications is becoming so critical. You're not going to achieve that through any digital transformation. You're going to deal with it with the partnerships, as Donna's alluded to, and having that partnership between your logistics provider and yourself in order to try to offset what could be a mini crisis of being able to get capacity through the system. And it's only through collaboration, communication, are we going to be able to accomplish that, in my opinion.
Thank you. And
Dave, just as an example of that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Victoria, but there were a couple of times in the past few months where, in dealing with COVID, we would get a message from a partner that their entire internal team was afflicted with COVID, and, such a sad situation. if we did not have such strong communication and a deep relationship built with them and be able to respond to help with their emergency, it would have been catastrophic failure. So, being able to regularly communicate, it really has helped save a number of situations just recently.
Yeah, and Donna, I'm sorry, just to carry on to that, a very specific example, distributing vaccines in very good relationships between the vaccine producer and the logistics provider. But guess what? They can't get dry ice because dry ice is frozen up, pardon my pun. But they can't get dry ice. So they forgot to bring another party into that communication stream that was so critical to make sure that the supply chain stays as resilient as possible. So communication can't be just two partners, but it's got to be the entire everyone within the supply chain to make it effective. And I think, Donna, I think you guys are doing that quite effectively.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we try. I think it's in the last few years and most recently, through this last pandemic, we've seen that, the client vendor relationship really is fading away. It's truly you establish partnerships and you work for the benefit of all and the success of all. And it's really been most effective.
Yes, and what frustrates, I'm sorry, but I have to get this off my mind, that I'm really tired of shippers treating logistics as a commodity and not treating it as a partnership. And we've got to get more and more into building the partnerships. And I think one thing COVID has taught us is that we better spend more time on communication, building that partnership.
Thank you. Bindia, do you want to weigh in? I think you're the only one who hasn't weighed in on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's points are perfectly valid. And just to emphasize, it's communication, transparency, trust, right? These three things go hand in hand. A lot of customers in the post-COVID world asking suppliers to be more transparent. Many suppliers are opening their kimonos and sharing a lot of information about their operations, their business. The worst thing a customer can do in a situation like that is take business away from a supplier based on the data that they shared or based on the transparency provided. I think what is really important is trust and transparency go side by side, and working together to fix the problem, I think, builds stronger relationships. Customers have a responsibility to their suppliers as well that goes beyond just getting parts, getting at the best price. Working together builds, and I have many examples based on my many years career in procurement. We had a situation in 2009 where one of our suppliers was going bankrupt. And we looked at our data. It was a critical supplier for us. If we had lost that supplier, it would have been $9 billion in revenue impact. But because they were so transparent with us, we actually were able to work with them, place 10 years of lifetime buy orders on them within a 3-month period. They were able to go to their creditors and get secure financing, which pulled them out of bankruptcy. So what I'm talking about is this incredible joint responsibility where the two companies, the customer and the supplier, work together to pull the supplier out of a very tough situation. And that happened when transparency and trust work together, go hand in hand. The supplier's transparency about their financial difficulty could have easily been punished by the customer, which was, in this case, the electronics company that I worked at. But I think that's where the big lesson learned is the world is incredibly interconnected. ResLink maps the global supply chain. We know that it is 2 tiers deep, and beyond the second tier, the supply chain sort of converges into a diamond shape. It fans out at the first tier, and then everybody sort of buys from the same 50 suppliers at that second tier level. And so that's where these interrelationships, the trust, the communication, the transparency, all of these things go towards building a better partnership and a more resilient, future-oriented supply chain. that we've been talking about.
Thank
If I
you.
could just
Yeah, go
add,
ahead. Go ahead, Chip.
Victoria. By the way, other strategies occurred during the Great Recession in terms of how to keep a supplier base healthy. And our specific suppliers, Apple actually acquired some of its suppliers who were under risk and later on spun them off. And that's another way of accomplishing the same thing, which is stabilizing your supplier base. We talked a lot about the value of trust, very much related to the value of information and the ability to monetize data. You have to have your suppliers willing to give you data. Toyota, with its first-tier suppliers, its Keiretsu, requires it. But in some cases, particularly some of the U.S. OEMs for durable goods manufacturing, can't get that from their first-tier suppliers. The relationship between an OEM and a supplier actually begins with sourcing. If you do if you're honest with the people you're looking at perhaps bringing on board as a supplier, and you are effective in that process rather than developing an adversarial relationship right away, that's an important time to actually start building a good relationship, is during the sourcing exercise. Toyota does a wonderful job of that, by the way.
Thank you. You all anticipated my next question. You mentioned relationships and partnerships and the importance of building that. At DC Velocity, we've written a lot recently about how the pandemic has sort of made companies sort of refocus on all of these issues. I'll just ask each of you, would you agree that that's sort of happening? It's kind of why we're talking about this today, but are we actually seeing that out in the real world? Are companies sort of making the efforts they need to make to build these important relationships and work toward resilience? And anyone can chime in on that.
Well, one of the things that Victoria, okay. One of the things.
Chip. Go ahead, Chip, then Bindia. Go ahead.
This will be quick. There are companies that are very strategic about relationships that are partnerships, longer-term partnerships, and those relationships that are transactional. So there's a decision to say this is going to be an area where we just buy what we can, on the spot market, maybe transportation, and where we're going to have a long-term 3PL, for example. So that's a strategic decision, I think.
Bindia, you were going to weigh in on that too, about whether, what's really happening out there.
Yeah, I was going to say that you are seeing the full gamut or the full spectrum of behaviors, good and bad, right? We've seen in certain apparel, footwear type of companies, when the first wave of the pandemic started and malls shut down, retail locations started to shut down, all those little manufacturers in Bangladesh and other countries, low-income countries, these suppliers were sitting on shipments. They had bought material, they had built the raw material, they were ready to ship, and customers canceled orders en masse, refused to pay. It put a lot of very small entrepreneurs in a lot of difficulty. Many companies shut down, actually, because guess what? It's a small company has 2 to 3 months of cash. And a lot of this cash is tied up in raw materials, inventory, and if they can't ship and if the customer cancels the order, they're sitting there holding inventory they can't sell, and it puts them under. So we have seen a record number of bankruptcies, a record number of force majeure, profit warnings, layoffs, and all of that. All this has been in the news, but a lot of that is as a result of this behavior. Now, it is not good or bad. Everyone has to, at some point, not everyone is Apple and sitting on, a nation's reserves in cash in their balance sheet. So every company has different challenges and nuances. Some things that we saw that were really good practices that even smaller companies were able to do. Some things were honor contracts. pay ahead to their suppliers who are experiencing difficulty. Usually companies pay suppliers after the supplier ships. In some cases, the customers placed orders and paid the supplier so that they could secure cash to buy raw materials for the orders. Other customers paid multiple months in advance. Especially, and again, these types of things are more doable when you are in a supply chain where your fortunes are tied together. If you're in apparel where you can easily switch from factory A to factory B, white shirts are white shirts, then there's really no loyalty. But where we see companies in semiconductor, life science, healthcare, these companies, these industries, your fortunes are tied to your suppliers. You cannot switch from supplier A to supplier B. We see good practices in these industries where companies are taking care of suppliers are more transparent with their customers. Both parties understand that we are intertwined. Supply continuity to a customer means revenue continuity or revenue assurance to a supplier. So this is not a fight. This is where one area where our interests are very aligned. And so there's a lot of opportunity to really build that long-term partnership.
And I agree with most of what Medea has said, but I'm a little bit concerned because I really believe that what companies have done in order to get out of the COVID-19 is they've rushed into buying the best technology to help me get out of the problem. And I like to try and tell people we've got to go back to basics. It's all about the people and the relationships, because it's those people and getting the right people in the right places, which I call having the digital dexterity. And then those people are the ones that are going to have to build the processes. And then let's look at the enabling technology. So really concentrate on the relationship. But I do have a concern and a caution that I think a lot of companies, in order to get more resilient, are looking a little bit too much. I hope, I don't know how many technology providers we have here, are turning over to technology and not spending enough time on the people and building the relationships and build the new processes that's going to make us resilient.
Yeah. Thank you. Donna, go ahead.
Sure. We're a process and people company. And so, we've seen over the last few months, many of our clients being much more vulnerable during conversations that we have with them. There's not so much, I'm going to tell you what I need, so you can respond to that with a price. It's, look, these are the kinds of things we're anticipating. We're still going to experience labor shortages. We're still going to have some issues with technology as we adopt some new tools and techniques. It could be anything from, more growth with the volume increases that we're seeing in the LTL market. Everybody's at capacity. So, they're talking to us about the issues that they're dealing with and then saying, how can you help me? And whether it's through a back office process, a front office process, or, IT outsourcing projects, you just find that people are being much more upfront and open and really looking to solve problems in a mutually beneficial way. And so those relationships, are just so critical. One thing we're also seeing is our clients asking for longer term contracts, because we are investing so much in the relationship, in the infrastructure of the relationship, that, a longer term contract is preferable to them. And so, that's a nice outcome as well for both. There's stability and there's peace of mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We're just about out of time. There are so many areas that we didn't get to. I'm going to just throw out one last question. Sort of any final thoughts that you all have. There are topics we didn't delve too much into. Labor, I think Donna just mentioned that a little bit, and challenges there and some other things. Any sort of final thoughts? And I'll start with you, Dave.
No, I think we've covered a lot. I go back and say I think a resiliency goes back to the building of the relationships, and putting the importance of your people and being able to understand that having the right people in the right places to enable us to really build some very, very robust processes and learn from from the last year to be able to build processes that are really, really going to make us more resilient by building stronger and better relationships across the integrated supply chain is what's going to be successful in the future. Then let's look at technology and the enabling technology. And once you wrap all that together, I think it'll put everyone in a position to be able to combat anything that would occur in the future.
Thank you. Chip, how about you? Any final thoughts or areas we didn't quite get to that you wanted to mention?
Yes. Well, one of the things that Dave mentioned, we have this interest in building more resilience in our supply chains. This is at the product and firm level, and also building a more resilient ecosystem, manufacturing ecosystem at the national level. Just two different levels of resilience. One of the things that is true, if we build resilience in a supply chain with redundancy, that increases cost. And one maybe minor concern that I have, it might not take place right away, but as we go ahead and build more resilient supply chains, then we get in, if nothing happens, if we don't have crises, we might start taking cost out of those supply chains and hence actually making them more resilient to, or less resilient to disruptions. At the national level, what we're seeing now, and I think is very important, I mean, we need, all companies need healthy supplier bases. And that is something that each company can contribute to, but at the same time, somebody needs to be looking at them at a national level. And I think the government is taking on the responsibility for that now, the federal government a little bit more, with state and local governments as well. And I can't overemphasize the importance of planning and investing so that we're ready for things that might happen, and try to understand a little bit more about what those unknowns are, so that we're better prepared. I think we're also realizing, as many of the panelists have said, that supply chains are going to be global. We're not going to be able to reduce our supply chains down to specifically domestic. And that we do have allies, trusted and secure allies. We want them to be economically healthy too, just like we'd like our supplier base to be healthy. So working with allies and trusted partners beyond our shores, I think, is very important. Monitoring, analyzing, and forecasting, keeping our finger on the pulse of industry and so forth is very important. That goes back to the arguments of visibility. And then just being able to provide quick response, responsible leadership when a crisis hits. You touched on labor. Workforce development is very important. We want to make sure that we have the right talent in our workforce. This is at a domestic level, so that we can actually provide the labor that's needed. Automation isn't going to do it entirely. Automation is a very nice tool, but it's we're still going to need a skilled labor force for many of the industries we're talking about. With that,
thank
Victoria,
you. Sorry. Thank you. That's great. So just two more to get through, and we're going to wrap up here. Donna, any final thoughts from you?
Sure. Yeah, from a DDC perspective, we're privileged to be part of the BPO industry. Industry statistics say this type of industry is going to continue to grow between 2021 and 2025 by about $4 billion. The main reason and factor for that are cost reductions and labor shortages here in the U.S. So, as a partner in that area, we believe it's just really critical to be the best partner possible and help to resolve some of those issues. And that's our goal.
Thank you. And Bindia, some final thoughts.
Yeah, just really quickly, there are really 4 ways to manage risk. One is you accept what risks you cannot do anything about, that meet your tolerance level. You mitigate proactively what is economical and there's a business case to mitigate. You have monitoring to capture everything that you weren't able to mitigate and weren't able to accept so that you're on top of it when there is something that happens. And then you insure, right? These are kind of the 4 things. And within these 4 is the happy optimal. But I think the most important thing to think about as we look at the future with visibility technology, with reglobalization, with inventory and lean and all of those strategies is that there is no such thing as risk-free. That simply does not exist because risk is prevalent. The whole of human existence is shaped by our ability and willingness to take risks. So the idea is to find out what is the most critical, what is the highest revenue. If you're in healthcare, what is important to patient outcomes or patient life, and protect those critical things, not by spend, but by impact to business, impact to our customer, and take care of that supply chain with all the wraparound strategies I just talked about. But I know that you'll never be in a 100% resilient world. So.
Thank you. Thank you. We have gone over time, but I just want to thank our panelists for your expertise this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, and to our audience, thank you for tuning in as well. This is the last session of the day, as I said at the start, so have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.